What if the most powerful empire on earth didn't fall to an enemy army, but to its own guards? For 600 years, the Ottoman Empire controlled 3 continents, crushed every army sent against it, and struck fear into every capital in Europe. And then, slowly, it didn't get conquered. It rotted from the inside by the very people sworn to protect it. This is the story of how the most feared power on the planet destroyed itself. By the 1500s, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of North Africa, controlling parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa all at once. At its head was Suleiman the Magnificent, a sultan so powerful his own people called him the lawgiver. Under his rule, Ottoman armies laid siege to Vienna itself. If that siege had succeeded, the entire map of Europe could look different today. The empire's military was built around an elite fighting force called the Janissaries, soldiers trained from childhood, fanatically loyal, and considered unbeatable in open battle for nearly 300 years. They were recruited through a system called the Devshirme, where boys from conquered Christian territories were taken, converted, and trained from a young age to become the most feared infantry in the world, loyal to nothing but the Sultan himself. Here's the number that made every European ruler nervous. At its height, the Ottoman Empire commanded more territory, more wealth, and more soldiers than any single power in Europe combined. Its navy dominated the Mediterranean. Its bureaucracy ran one of the most sophisticated tax and legal systems on earth. Nothing, it seemed, could break it, except itself. The Janissaries were supposed to be the empire's greatest weapon. Instead, they became its first fatal weakness. Originally, Janissaries weren't allowed to marry, own property, or have children, and they existed purely to serve the Sultan, with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. But over generations, that changed. They won the right to marry, to pass their positions to their sons, to grow rich instead of loyal. By the 1600s, the Janissaries weren't just soldiers anymore, and they were a political power capable of making or breaking a sultan, and they used it. Here's the moment that should stop you. Janissaries assassinated multiple sultans who tried to reform or reduce their power. An army that was supposed to protect the throne had become powerful enough to remove whoever sat on it. Even worse, the once feared fighting force stopped training the way it used to. Positions that used to be earned through combat and loyalty became something you could simply buy or inherit. By the late 1700s, thousands of men were collecting a Janissary's salary who had never fought in a single battle. The empire's greatest weapon had turned into a gun pointed at its own head, and a rusted one at that. While the army was quietly seizing power from the outside, something just as dangerous was happening from the inside, deep within the palace walls. Historians call this era the Sultanate of Women, a period where the sultan's mothers and wives, operating from the imperial harem, wielded more real political power than the sultans themselves. Here's a detail that sounds made up, but isn't. Future sultans were locked away in a section of the palace literally called the cage, sometimes for decades, specifically so they couldn't threaten whoever currently sat on the throne. Which means the empire's next ruler often stepped out of a locked room and directly onto the world's most powerful throne, having never commanded a single soldier, negotiated a single treaty, or made a single real decision in his life. One sultan, Ibrahim, was so mentally unstable and disconnected from actual governance that historians still debate how functional Ottoman leadership even was during his reign, until the same Janissaries, who'd already learned they could remove a sultan, removed him too. Meanwhile, political decisions were quietly made behind palace walls by people with no official title, no accountability, and no one to check their power. Grand viziers, palace advisors, and the Sultan's own family fought constant, brutal power struggles just to control who actually ran the empire day to day. Two systems built to protect the empire, the army and the palace, had each quietly become power struggles fighting for control instead of forces holding the empire together. Here's the trap that killed empires throughout history. And the Ottomans walked right into it. They stopped changing while the rest of the world kept moving. While European nations were undergoing scientific revolutions, industrializing their economies, and modernizing their militaries, the Ottoman Empire largely held on to the same systems that had worked for centuries. Because those systems had made them powerful for so long, no one wanted to risk changing them. There's a deeper problem hiding underneath all of this: corruption in how the empire actually collected its money. Provincial tax collection was often handed out to the highest bidder in a system called tax farming, meaning local officials paid the empire up front for the right to collect taxes, then squeezed the population for as much as they could get away with keeping the difference. The empire got its money, the people got exploited, and loyalty to the sultan, region by region, quietly eroded. By the 1800s, the empire that once terrified Europe was being called something else entirely by the same nations that used to fear it: the sick man of Europe. The Ottomans began borrowing massive amounts of money from European banks just to keep the empire running. By the late 1800s, so much of the empire's finances were controlled by foreign creditors that European powers effectively had direct influence over Ottoman economic policy, from inside a Western-run financial oversight body operating on Ottoman soil, collecting Ottoman taxes directly to pay back Ottoman debts. An empire that once conquered foreign nations was now, quietly, being financially controlled by them. The empire actually saw this coming. Reformers tried to fix it twice. First, a sweeping set of modernization reforms starting in the mid-1800s. When that wasn't enough, a group of young military officers didn't just propose more reform. They seized the government by force in 1908, promising to save the empire from itself. Neither one worked. By the time both attempts happened, the empire had already lost too much territory, too much money, and too much internal trust to actually reverse course, proving that by then, no amount of reform could outrun decades of rot. By the early 1900s, territory the Ottomans had held for centuries began breaking away, one region at a time: Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Egypt, each declaring independence or falling under foreign control. The Balkan Wars alone, fought just before World War I, stripped away most of the empire's remaining territory in Europe in a matter of months. Then came the final blow, World War I. The Ottomans allied with Germany and the Central Powers, betting everything on one last war to reclaim their strength. They lost. When the war ended, the empire that once stretched across 3 continents was carved apart entirely by the victorious powers. Its remaining territories divided up in negotiations the Ottomans had almost no say in. In 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate, a system of rule that had lasted over 600 years, was formally abolished, not by a foreign conqueror storming the palace gates, by the empire's own final unraveling, ending in the creation of the modern nation of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. 600 years. Ended not by the armies that once feared it, but by the corruption, stagnation, and power struggles built up slowly from within over centuries. An army that seized too much power. A palace run by people no one voted for or held accountable. A tax system that rewarded exploitation over loyalty. A government that refused to change while the rest of the world modernized around it. Rome collapsed the same way. So did the Ottomans. If you had to guess, which empire do you think is repeating these same mistakes right now? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe for the next episode where we break down the empire that fell in a single day.